Her arm is broken. You just broke her arm. I screamed at the top of my lungs, holding my disabled daughter in my arms as she sobbed in pain. HOA Karen stood over us, red-faced, unbothered, still clutching her stupid clipboard like it was a badge of power. She shouldn't be on private walkways if she can't handle them, she snapped without an ounce of remorse. Around us, people froze, some pulling out phones, others whispering in disbelief. A kid nearby started crying. An elderly man dropped his walking stick in shock. The bright afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement, but nothing was darker than the fury that now brewed in my chest. Karen had just yanked my daughter from her wheelchair during a supposed community beautification day because she was scuffing the new sidewalk sealant. And now? My daughter's tiny arm bent at a grotesque angle. That was the moment Karen messed with the wrong father. Because what Karen didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that I lead federal criminal investigations for a living. And I was about to turn her smug little world inside out. It was supposed to be a normal Sunday. Just a casual stroll to the neighborhood park, something I did with Lily every weekend. She loved watching the ducks by the pond, even if her muscles didn't work like they used to. Born with spastic cerebral palsy, Lily had grown up used to wheelchairs, physical therapy, and a world that often looked the other way. But not me. I made sure she saw everything, touched everything, felt everything. She was brave, curious, and she always wore this sparkly rainbow hoodie that made her look like the sunshine itself. And then came Karen, storming in like a cloud full of lightning, armed with HOA flyers and a superiority complex big enough to collapse a roof. The conflict began the moment Lily's front wheel clipped a freshly resealed section of pavement. Karen materialized from nowhere, shrieking like a hawk. "This is for pedestrians only. You're not allowed to roll over wet surfaces." I tried explaining that the pavement wasn't wet, that it had dried hours ago, but Karen wasn't interested in facts. Her voice grew louder, more aggressive. She stepped closer to Lily, pointing and berating. And then, without warning, she reached forward and yanked Lily's wheelchair backwards. My daughter let out a sharp scream. There was a sickening crack. The entire world paused for a fraction of a second, then chaos erupted. I lunged, scooping Lily up as she cried out in agony. I didn't even process what had happened at first. Her elbow was twisted unnaturally, her face pale and streaked with tears. I turned on Karen, who had the audacity to say, "It's not my fault if someone falls when they're in the way." That's when I lost my voice from screaming. My instincts warred with my training. I wanted to arrest her on the spot, to make her taste the consequences she always thought she was above. But I had a bigger priority, my daughter. I told the crowd to call 911. A few neighbors ran to their houses. A young woman started filming. Karen shouted at her to stop recording. That only made more people hit record. Paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. One of them, a tall, bearded man named Lou, gave Karen a nod. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said in a strange tone. Karen smiled and whispered something in his ear. That raised every red flag in my mind. Lou barely looked at Lily before saying, "Doesn't look too bad. Probably just a sprain." But another EMT, a woman with a braid and sharp eyes, knelt beside me and quietly said, "Take her to county. Get an X-ray. And get a report. Trust me." Her words told me everything. Something was off. There was more to this HOA than met the eye. And the person at the center of it, Karen, wasn't just power drunk. She was dangerous and connected. The ride to the hospital was filled with Lily's sniffles and my racing thoughts. I gripped her little fingers gently with one hand while the other scrolled through surveillance footage on my phone from our porch camera. We had a clear shot of Karen yanking the chair. Crystal clear. Time-stamped. Witnessed. Slam dunk. But I wasn't just going to press assault charges. That would be too easy for someone like her. I had seen people like Karen before, entitled, manipulative, legally slippery. No, I was going to dismantle everything she had built. And I had the tools to do it. As Lily was taken into radiology, I sat in the waiting area and sent off a quiet text to my contact in records. Pull everything on HOA President Karen Delaney. Prior complaints, citations, liens, lawsuits, anything sealed. I need it fast. 15 minutes later, I got the reply. You'll want to sit down for this one. The files that followed weren't just long, they were disturbing. Fines issued to families for having discolored curtains. Evictions over minor landscaping delays. Faked noise complaints against renters with kids. Even a formal complaint from a blind veteran who said she banned him from the pool because his dog was a distraction. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. This wasn't about Lily anymore. This was about years of unchecked power and harm. Back at home later that night, I tucked Lily into bed. Her arm was in a temporary cast, and she had finally fallen asleep after her medication kicked in. I watched her chest rise and fall and felt a silent storm gathering inside me. This little girl was the light of my life. I'd investigated money launderers, white-collar criminals, violent gangs, but nothing had ever made me as angry as watching my daughter suffer at the hands of a petty tyrant in a neighborhood polo shirt. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I created a folder titled HOA Deep Dive. I poured myself a glass of water, opened the first Karen file, and hit play on a neighborhood security feed I'd tapped into. Karen's voice came through clear as crystal. I don't care if she's disabled. She's a liability. Someone needs to teach them a lesson. And there it was. Not an accident. Not an impulsive mistake. A premeditated mindset. A rotten core. I hit save. And then I smiled. Not the kind of smile that comes from joy, but the kind that comes right before a storm hit. This wasn't just going to be a personal lawsuit. This was about to be a federal-level takedown. And by the time I was done, HOA Karen would be known coast to coast, not as a leader, but as a warning. The next morning began quietly, almost eerily so. The kind of calm that made your skin itch because it didn't feel earned. I made Lily her favorite breakfast, banana pancakes with extra whipped cream, and tried to keep my smile convincing. She was sore and tired but trying to be strong. She always did that, even when she didn't have to. I could tell her arm throbbed beneath the cast, but she didn't want to ruin the morning. She even made a joke about looking like a tiny robot with a broken wing. I laughed, because it's what a father's supposed to do, but my brain wasn't at the table. It was already deep into dossiers, pulled security footage, public records, and the beginning of a digital web that I intended to unravel thread by thread. Karen had done far more than snap my daughter's arm. She'd opened a door to something festering, something that had gone unchecked for too long. I was done playing neighbor. It was time to do what I do best. Follow the lies, expose the corruption, and burn it to the ground legally, piece by piece. I began by mapping out the HOA leadership structure. Karen wasn't just the president. She was the treasurer, head of zoning compliance, and unofficial enforcer of all bylaws. That kind of centralization wasn't just rare, it was a red flag. Power hoarders like her don't operate alone. They need enablers. My guess? She had a circle. People she rewarded with influence or silence, depending on how useful they were. I used my clearance to access sealed public records and started flagging patterns. There were residents who mysteriously moved out after multiple fines. Families with disabled children, renters, veterans. I dug deeper into those exit cases and found a disturbing common denominator. Most had filed complaints against the HOA. Every single one of them vanished from the neighborhood within 3 months of doing so. Next, I looked into Karen's personal connections. A lot of names were tossed around at meetings: contractors, lawyers, vendors. One name popped out: Glenn Bishop. He was listed as legal advisor on internal HOA note. That might have sounded official if I hadn't found out his law license was revoked 8 years ago for forging affidavit. Somehow, he still drafted eviction letters, threatened residents with lawsuits, and sent cease and desists on behalf of the HOA. I traced a few of those letters and found reused templates from old firm documents he was never authorized to use. It was fraud. Plain and simple. But what stunned me more was how no one had reported it, probably because they assumed it was real. The illusion of legal power is sometimes more effective than actual legality, especially when you're targeting people too scared or too busy to fight back. I needed more than data. I needed testimony. I made some quiet phone calls to former residents. A few were wary, understandably, but one woman named Sandra agreed to meet me. She was a single mother who had been fined over 75 times in 1 year for things like excessive wind chimes and disorderly planting. Her son had autism, and she said Karen once told her, "Maybe if you spent less time in therapy sessions and more time pulling weeds, we wouldn't have to fine you." That same week, her car was towed, her mailbox was removed due to zoning changes, and 3 fake complaints were filed against her by supposed neighbors. She finally left when the HOA tried to revoke her right to park in front of her own home. Hearing her speak, I saw the same raw edge in her voice that I had felt the day Karen grabbed Lily. There was trauma there. Pain that hadn't been acknowledged. I promised her it would be. I returned home to find Karen standing in front of my driveway, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect my grass. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her until she turned and walked away. She knew she had gone too far, but she didn't know what I was building behind the scenes. That night, I launched what I called Karen Cam, a high-definition audio and video setup aimed directly at the sidewalk, my driveway, and the street beyond. If she even breathed in my direction again, I'd catch it. But I wasn't just watching her anymore, I was also watching her cronies. There was a man named Rich, the head of maintenance, who was really just a guy who followed Karen around nodding. He also happened to run the HOA's landscape contracts and had been billing the association for work never done. I pulled aerial satellite images. On dates where thousands of dollars had supposedly been spent trimming communal foliage, the yards remained untouched. No work crews, no trucks. Just phantom expenses. The more I dug, the more it smelled like racketeering disguised as community management. Karen had built herself a little empire inside our neighborhood. She used rules as weapons and compliance as currency. And anyone who couldn't or wouldn't play along was either shamed, fined, or pushed out. I realized the HOA board was just a hollow puppet show. There were monthly meetings, sure, but everything was pre-decided by Karen and her inner circle. Residents who spoke up were given tasks like street light monitor or bush height enforcement, ridiculous fake roles to distract them or make them feel included. Meanwhile, the real power moves were happening between wine socials and country club brunches. The break in the case came one evening when I received an anonymous email. No subject line. Just one sentence. Check the hidden minutes from March 17th. Attached was an audio file. I played it. It was a private board meeting Karen had held off record, no agenda, just hushed voices. In the clip, she was bragging about how she'd put that federal guy in his place, referring to me, clearly unaware of what I really did for a living. But then came the smoking gun. She laughed and said, "It's not my fault his little girl can't handle a rough nudge. Maybe next time she stays indoors where broken things belong." That sentence alone could end careers, but I wasn't done. In the background, Glenn Bishop could be heard saying, "Just keep the fines coming. If they drown in fees, they won't have time to sue." That audio wasn't just disturbing, it was a blueprint for extortion. I had enough to begin drafting the official federal complaint, but I still wanted one final piece. I needed Karen to incriminate herself again. This time on camera in front of witnesses with no escape hatch. I started planning the setup with a level of detail I usually reserved for organized crime syndicates. Because that's what this was. A polished little HOA cartel hiding behind tulip festivals and bake sales. Lily was doing better. Her spirits had lifted, though her arms still made sleep difficult. She asked me why Karen hated her so much. I told her the truth. Some people are scared of good things they don't understand, and they try to crush them before they have a chance to shine. She blinked at me and said, "That's dumb. I shine all the time." She wasn't wrong. And I wasn't done. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "She's going to regret ever meeting you, kiddo." The walls around Karen were tightening. The threads of her little kingdom were coming undone. She just hadn't seen the spider yet. But she would. Soon. 2 days later, the plan was in motion. I'd arranged a casual neighborhood gathering, supposedly to raise awareness for accessibility improvements in our community. I even used the HOA's own forum to post about it, knowing Karen monitored every thread like a hawk. I phrased it carefully, highlighting community pride, inclusion, and beautification, buzzwords Karen loved. As expected, she commented almost immediately, giving it her official support, and suggesting it take place on the community lawn next to the fountain she had installed last year and named after herself. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. But this wasn't just about baiting her. I had arranged for 2 federal associates, posing as local disability advocates, to attend and film everything. I had audio and video surveillance in place, and several residents who had privately complained about Karen were ready to speak if the moment turned. The day of the event was bright and clear. Tables were set up with snacks and brochures. Lily was there too, resting comfortably in her wheelchair, arms still in a cast but excited. She wore her sparkly rainbow hoodie again, as if it had become her quiet form of resistance. I saw Karen approaching from across the lawn, her usual smug gait on full display. Clipboard in one hand, oversized sunglasses in the other, and that condescending smile that had probably been perfected in a mirror. She greeted a few residents, posed for a couple pictures like a politician, then made her way toward us. I saw her eyes settle on Lily, then flick up to me, then back to the banner we had hung. Equal space. Equal respect. Her lips twitched. It was already working. She wasted no time. "Hello, everyone," she announced in that artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted to control the room. "So glad we could all gather to support the community. Though I do wish I had been consulted more thoroughly on the theme. Certain language, while well-intentioned, can come off divisive." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to get comfortable, to feel like she still held the leash. I just nodded and thanked her for her attendance. Around us, people listened. A few exchanged looks. One woman leaned to whisper something to her husband, who quickly pulled out his phone and started recording. Another signal that momentum was shifting. Karen walked over to Lily and bent slightly, speaking to her like one might address a dog. "You're so brave, sweetheart. Let's try to be extra careful today, okay?" My daughter didn't look at her. She just said, softly but clearly, "Don't touch me." Karen recoiled like she'd been slapped, eyes darting toward me. "She's obviously still processing things." "We understand," she said. That was the opening I needed. I stepped in and said, "Actually, we've all been processing. Which is why today's about shedding light on some patterns in our HOA that haven't just excluded people, but harmed them." Karen froze, her smile faltering. "I'm sorry, what patterns?" she said. "I think I'd know if there was harm." I turned slightly and gave a subtle nod to one of the attendees. That was the cue. A woman named Janice, who had been fined over 50 times for having unapproved solar lights, stepped forward with a printed letter in hand. "This is from you, Karen," she said. "You fined me $300 for putting up a wheelchair ramp for my mother. Then you told me to remove it because it wasn't aesthetically appropriate. My mother tripped using the back door and cracked 2 ribs." The crowd gasped. Karen began to sputter. "Well, there were protocols." But another man stepped up. "I got a $1,200 fine for non-compliant lawn furniture. The same set was in the HOA brochure 3 months earlier," he said. "You told me to move because renters don't belong in leadership zones. I had lived here 8 years. Someone else added, You threatened to evict my sister because she had a PTSD support dog that barked once. One time. During fireworks. The testimonials kept coming, voices rising, and Karen's face became a slow-motion collapse. It was like watching a dam split open, years of pressure finally tearing through. She tried interrupting, but someone else shouted, "Let him finish!" Her power, so carefully built through fear and manipulation, was slipping with every word spoken. Then came the final blow. I stepped forward again and played the audio file from the hidden March 17th meeting. Her voice rang out clearly, that mocking tone unmistakable. The crowd listened in stunned silence as she laughed about my daughter's injury, referring to her as broken things and bragging about keeping the weak ones away from community resources. People didn't just gasp, they stepped back. One woman began to cry. Karen tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She dropped her clipboard, hands shaking, and looked around for support. There was none. "I'm Agent Michael Trent," I finally said, voice even but forceful. "I lead federal criminal investigations into civil rights violations and corrupt local entities. And what you've done isn't just unethical. It's criminal." Dead silence. Then, like thunder, a murmur of disbelief and shock rippled through the crowd. Karen turned pale, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I stepped closer. "This is your official notification that a federal investigation is now underway into this HOA and its operations under your leadership. Do not destroy documents, do not contact residents, and do not obstruct what's coming." I handed her a folder. "That's your copy of the formal complaint." Karen didn't faint, but she came close. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to hold the edge of a table. "You can't do this," she hissed. You're not allowed to use personal grievances. This is retaliation." I calmly replied, "It's not retaliation. It's accountability." She looked around once more, but all she saw were eyes. Angry eyes. Betrayed eyes. She picked up her clipboard like a shield and walked away, shaky and stunned. Nobody followed her. She was no longer their queen. She was just a villain in an unraveling story. That night, I received over 30 emails from residents offering statements, evidence, screenshots of threats, and secret recordings. People were no longer afraid. Once the first crack appeared in Karen's armor, the entire facade collapsed. Fear had kept her in power, but exposure tore her out of it. And now that the community had seen the truth, they weren't going back. Lily asked me that night if Karen was going to jail. I told her maybe not right away, but justice was a process, and it had started. She nodded and whispered, "Good. She doesn't get to break people and smile." I looked at her and felt a strange mix of pride and grief. My daughter had been hurt in the most brutal, personal way, but her strength, her ability to shine through it, had sparked something unstoppable. I kissed her forehead and turned off the lights. Outside, the quiet was different now. It wasn't Karen's kind of quiet, the kind built on silence and fear. It was the kind that came before a reckoning, and it was just getting started. 2 days after the community gathering, everything moved faster than even I anticipated. The video footage from the event had gone viral, shared first on a neighborhood Facebook group, then picked up by local news. Within 24 hours, a segment aired showing Karen's smug face turning ghost white as the audio played, her cruel words about my daughter echoing over headlines that read, "HOA President mocked disabled child, now faces federal investigation." I didn't leak it, but I wasn't surprised. People were angry, people were tired, and most of all, people had finally seen behind the curtain. That same morning, I sat in a government office across the city, handing over the case file I'd compiled. Civil rights lawyers, auditors, and a special task unit began parsing through every detail. Fraud, abuse of power, forged legal notices, extortion, all laid bare in evidence that couldn't be ignored. By the end of the week, subpoenas were issued for the HOA's financial records, internal communications, and vendor contracts. The first raid came early on a Thursday morning. Black SUVs rolled up outside the HOA building, a modest brick structure that always looked like it thought it was more important than it was. Agents moved fast, efficient and silent, as I watched from a car across the street. Karen wasn't there. She had gone on leave suddenly the day before, likely tipped off by someone. But it didn't matter. The building was emptied, computers seized, boxes carried out. There was no hiding now. This wasn't a rumor anymore. It was real. It was happening. The faces of the board members said everything. They looked like people who had lived above consequences for too long and were now experiencing what the rest of us called accountability. Karen, meanwhile, was still pretending to be untouchable. She called a last-minute press conference in her backyard, standing stiffly behind a podium with the HOA logo printed across it. She rambled about smear campaigns, outsiders trying to dismantle community values, and distorted audio that had been maliciously edited. Behind her, a neighbor's dog barked the entire time, and the microphone screeched just as she tried to deliver her closing line. Even the universe seemed done with her. But her biggest mistake came in what she did next. Rather than laying low, she filed a restraining order against me, claiming I was stalking her and using government resources to harass her. That order hit the desk of my supervisor, who laughed, handed it back to me, and said, "Well, she's just signed her own warrant for a full-scale dig." I went back into the files and requested archived footage from Karen's tenure, old HOA meetings, community complaint logs, email backup. What we found made everything we already knew look tame. Karen had not only inflated fines and forged documents, she'd been redirecting funds to a private account labeled Community Improvement Reimbursements. Over $312,000 had been siphoned in small transactions, many to shell companies that didn't exist. She had used HOA funds to pay for personal travel, home renovations, even cosmetic surgery. The trail was clear. And it wasn't just her. 2 other board members had benefited. One had received payments through a fake landscaping company. Another was rerouting renovation grants to a cousin's construction firm. It was a network of petty greed built under the illusion of order. I wasn't the only one collecting statements anymore. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had launched a civil investigation, and multiple residents had filed complaints with the state attorney general. The HOA was paralyzed. No one was running meetings, violations were no longer being issued, and the once feared Karen letters stopped arriving. And the neighborhood, for the first time in years, was quiet in a good way. Sidewalks once patrolled for chalk art were now covered in it. Someone even spray-painted a crude cartoon of Karen on the clubhouse door with the words, "Queen of Nothing," underneath. The community was reclaiming its identity. The best part came when a woman named Mrs. Holloway stepped forward. She was nearly 80, walked with a cane, and had once been fined by Karen for hazardous porch clutter because of her potted tomato plants. She handed over a dusty folder filled with handwritten records, photographs, and even recorded phone calls. Karen had tried to force her into selling her house, saying she was lowering the HOA's prestige value. It turned out Karen had been trying to buy up older homes to flip them, using her influence to devalue the properties first, then quietly purchasing them through a proxy. Holloway had refused. And now, she smiled as she handed me the evidence. "I've waited a long time for her to trip over her own lies," she said. "Glad to see it finally happened." That afternoon, Karen was officially arrested. No dramatic chase, no handcuffs in front of cameras. She turned herself in, wearing all beige like she was already dressing for prison. The charges were extensive: fraud, civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction, and reckless endangerment among them. Her bail was denied, not just because of the severity of the crimes, but because she had been caught trying to transfer money to an offshore account the day before. She was taken into federal custody, and when she passed me in the hallway of the courthouse, she didn't even make eye contact. The Karen who had once screamed in my daughter's face was now silent, deflated, and utterly unrecognizable. But the story didn't end there. As part of the recovery process, I met with a group of residents to help restructure the HOA. I wasn't interested in being in charge, but I helped them design a new charter, one that guaranteed transparency, capped enforcement powers, and reserved a permanent board seat for a representative of the disabled community. Lily would never be dismissed again. No child would. And the woman who once ruled the neighborhood with fear was now the face of why those rules needed checked. Lily's school held a small ceremony for her 1 week later. They called it Strength in Small Packages. She received a Community Bravery Award, and she got to tell her story in front of her classmate. She talked about what happened, not with sadness, but with pride. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, "and now people know that. Sometimes you have to speak up, even if your voice shakes." I watched from the back of the room, eyes blurry, heart pounding. Her little voice had changed more than just a street corner. It had sparked something none of us expected. That evening, a package arrived at our doorstep. No note, just a brown box. Inside was Karen's old clipboard, cracked in half and spray-painted with the words, "Property of Justice." I never found out who sent it, but I kept it on my office shelf, just as a reminder. Not of Karen, but of what people can do when they stop being afraid. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to settle into something new. Not peace exactly, but clarity. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. There were no passive-aggressive notices pinned to doors, no early morning shouting matches about mailbox paint. For the first time in years, people actually waved at each other without faking it. Children played without looking over their shoulders. And my daughter, arm finally healed and cast free, returned to the park she once feared. Lily wheeled herself along the same path where it all began and didn't flinch when she passed the spot where Karen had snapped her arm. She just looked at it, breathed, and kept moving forward. Watching her reclaim that space was more powerful than any courtroom verdict. Karen's trial began a month later. The courtroom was packed, a mix of curious citizens, reporters, and a few former HOA members pretending they'd had no idea what was going on. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her hair no longer styled, her once frequent smirk gone. The charges were read: wire fraud, embezzlement, civil rights violations, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and reckless endangerment. Her attorney, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the indictment, tried to argue that Karen was overworked and misunderstood, that her comments were taken out of context, that the financial inconsistencies were bookkeeping errors. But the jury didn't buy it. No one did. The evidence was overwhelming. Footage, documents, bank records, sworn statements, it was all laid out meticulously, methodically. Every lie unraveled like cheap thread. I testified on day 4. I was calm, composed, and factual. I didn't tell them how I felt when I held Lily in my arms that day, but I didn't need to. The photos, the medical reports, and the audio recordings said more than my words ever could. When I played the recording of Karen mocking my daughter and referring to her as a liability, you could feel the temperature in the room drop. Even the judge shifted in her seat. Karen never looked at me. Not once. Not when I entered, not when I spoke, and not when I stepped down. I imagine it was easier for her to pretend I didn't exist than to acknowledge that her entire empire had been dismantled by the very people she tried to silence. When the verdict came, it landed like a hammer. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for a separate hearing, but the judge made it clear that prison was inevitable. Karen was led out of the courtroom without ceremony, no cameras allowed for that part. But word spread fast. Local stations reported it within the hour. Social media exploded again. Memes popped up overnight. Someone edited a photo of her next to a cartoon gavel with the caption, HOA, handcuffs over arrogance. Another showed her infamous clipboard locked behind bars. My personal favorite was one where Lily's rainbow hoodie had been turned into a superhero cape with the tagline, "Justice wears sparkles." But beyond the jokes and headlines, something real had changed. At the next community meeting, now held under an interim board, the room was full, not with fear, but with energy. Neighbors volunteered for committees, suggested inclusive policies, and offered to help seniors with yard work instead of threatening them with fines. I saw people talk to each other for the first time without suspicion. One man stood up and said, "We forgot what it meant to live together, not just next to each other." That stuck with me. He was right. Karen had ruled with division and control. But now, people wanted connection. One afternoon, I took Lily to a small ceremony held by a nonprofit that supported children with disabilities. They had heard about her story and wanted to honor her. They gave her a plaque that read, "For the courage to speak when it was easier to be quiet." She held it like it was made of gold, eyes wide and glowing. Then she stood up and said something that silenced the entire room. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But now I know that if you speak the truth, even when it's scary, people will listen. And some of them will help. I stood in the back, hands in my pockets, heart full. She was becoming the kind of person I always hoped she would be. Not because of what happened, but because she chose to grow from it instead of shrink. Karen tried to appeal her sentence, of course. Claimed her health was failing, said prison would be inhumane, given her stress levels. The judge reviewed the appeal, then denied it with a single sentence. Stress is not a defense for systemic cruelty. Karen was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison with no early parole. Her personal assets were seized to repay the stolen funds. Her house, the one she'd once ruled from like a throne, was auctioned off. And in one of those strange twists of fate that life sometimes offers, it was purchased by a nonprofit that housed families with disabled children. They turned it into a transitional living home, complete with ramps, sensory gardens, and a play area. The same fountain she once named after herself was repurposed and renamed Hope's Corner. The plaque now read, "Dedicated to the strength of voices that won't be silenced." A reporter reached out to me for an interview. She wanted to do a follow-up piece about Lily, about justice, about how an entire community had stood up to one person's abuse of power. I agreed, under one condition, that the focus stay on the people who made it happen. She interviewed residents who had once been too afraid to speak. She highlighted how the HOA was being rebuilt from the ground up. She told the story of a girl who once just wanted to see ducks at the park and ended up inspiring a neighborhood to take back its dignity. The story went national. Letters started arriving, some from parents, others from kids in wheelchairs, thanking Lily for being brave. As life returned to a new kind of normal, Lily and I found ourselves walking, not rolling, down that sidewalk again one evening. Her therapy had been working, and while her mobility was still limited, she'd insisted on trying to walk part of the way. I held her hand, steadying her, each step slow but determined. She stopped at the spot where Karen had grabbed her and looked down. Then she grinned and said, "Let's keep going." I nodded, and together we walked past it without looking back. At home that night, she asked me if I thought Karen would ever apologize. I thought about it, then said, "Some people won't. But their silence doesn't make your truth any smaller." She nodded thoughtfully, then asked if we could make pancakes in the morning. I smiled and said yes. The past had taken a lot, but it hadn't taken that. In my office, the cracked clipboard still sat on my shelf, just above the federal complaint folder labeled "Closed." I didn't keep them to gloat. I kept them to remember. That power without empathy is just cruelty in costume. That silence enables the worst among us. And that sometimes, the smallest voice in the room carries the weight of justice when no one else dares to speak.